Good afternoon. We're going to get started, and I'm always sort of a provocative moderator, so we know our third speaker is on the way. I actually see her, but we're going to go ahead and get started so we can keep you on time and we can have the benefit of them all. So we've had a really exciting day today, and we want to push the limits on this conversation as well. The number of displaced persons increases on a daily basis. The drivers of displaced people are numerous and include, as you know, violence, war, economics, hunger, climate change, natural disasters, lack of resources, persecution, and disease. To address this continuing problem, there needs to be a shift in focus toward putting the voices of displaced people themselves in the center of responses that address not only short-term humanitarian needs, but long-term integration and livelihood. Today, we are so lucky we are going to hear from 3 different champions, and I will call them champions because I believe these are really champions themselves as individuals and their organizations who work for refugees and migrants through very different types of organizations. And we're going to have them guide us on how we all can help, because the time to act is now. So the full panelists of the full bios of the panelists are in the agenda, but I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot so you know who we have in front of us. To my left, we have Nasrat Khalid, who is the founder of a SEAL app. So I suggest you go and download it on your phone while we're talking here. He's also the chief strategist of Wall Development, and I don't want to say more importantly, but I'm very proud of the fact that he was the SID-US Award winner. He was born in Afghanistan and grew up working with international development organizations, starting with AED, which is FHI 360, then EDC, Chemonics, and later the World Bank in Afghanistan, South Asia, and later in DC. In 2017, he left the World Bank and founded the ASEAL platform. Sharif Ali is the CEO of Islamic Relief. He has served there since August of 2017. An attorney by background, he has worked in litigation prior to fully dedicating his career to the nonprofit sector. And my good friend, last but not least, Nazanin Ash is the CEO of Welcome US. This is a new U.S. national initiative to welcome and support refugees. Previously, she served as Vice President of Global Policy and Advocacy at the IRC, or International Rescue Committee. She also held very senior positions at USAID and the State Department. So thank you for all being here. And I'm going to lay the groundwork for our conversation and for your questions later on by a couple of questions. So I really want to hear the stories because you are champions here. And so I'm going to start with Nasrat and we'll just go down the panel. So, why are you passionate about this area? And tell me a little bit about your organization.
Thank you, and for having me, and thank you everyone for showing up today. A round of applause for all of you to start with. So I'm very passionate about refugees because I grew up as a refugee myself, and this is around 1990s, so I'm not that old. And I was, so as you may know about Afghanistan, I was the Soviet occupation, and then my family went on to the neighboring Pakistan because of the war. And growing up as a refugee was a very humbling experience, to say the least. That sort of first-hand experience and understanding of what people go through, makes it one of the most important things for me to go back to and try to solve some of those issues. And what I do today is I'm trying to drive a change in the international development sector. I worked pretty much all of my life in the international development sector, so a lot of US-based implementing agencies, and then working with donors like the World Bank, which has a very different lens to development than what I saw as an individual. And then my background is technology, so I think, and I can argue, the development sector is probably the last sector that technology adoption happens in, whereas I think it should be the first sector where technology adoption should happen. So trying to mix both of them with a seal, using technology, bringing on everyday people to be able to engage in very problematic issues that somehow are always left for these major institutions to deal with. I think bringing more individuals, everyday people into that aspect through technology, through the phones, is probably the easiest way so we can all tackle these problems.
And can I just ask you to explain a little bit more about your app for those of you who haven't downloaded it yet, but can you explain how it functions?
Yeah, so it's very simple from a user perspective. You download the app, it's the same as any other app from the App Store. It's spelled as ASEEL, and it does two important things. And we have the app currently in Afghanistan and in Turkey, the two countries that we support people with. And you can buy aid packages and assign them to people that you know. And hopefully later on I can explain a little bit about that. Is in the development space, we usually, or in the charity space, we just give money, and the institution says thank you. And that's kind of that. If we do a really big contribution, then we look at their M&E reports. We think a little bit more different than that, and you can buy a package, you can assign it to somebody that you know, or you can donate the package and then start really looking at where it goes, the families that get supported through that. So really focusing on transparency and making sure that the delivery of aid is as informative and as exciting as your Uber Eats order that comes to your home. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Sharif, a little bit about your history and your organization. And since I'm a lawyer too, I want to hear about giving up that legal career and going into this field.
Yeah, that's this could be a really long story, so I'm going to try to keep it short.
Okay.
Well, I'm a son of immigrants. My parents came to this country from Egypt, and I grew up and I went to college during 9/11. So at that point, I knew the world was about to change very drastically, and I said, how can I contribute to make it a more just and a better place? And I decided to go to law school. Not sure if that was the right answer, but it did help me get to take the path that I feel like I've been able to contribute. And while I was at law school, I was part of a community and economic development clinic, and we were serving undocumented folks to help them build up their own community-based organizations so they could amplify their voices and address the injustices that they were facing in a deeply segregated part of New York called Long Island, if any of you have been part of it. And from there, less than 20 years later, I got a call from Jack Markell, who's former governor of Delaware and the point person for President Biden, to say, hey, we really need Islamic Relief's help because there's this huge crisis with Afghans coming into this country and we don't have enough capacity to help them resettle here. And Islamic Relief was an institution that I think is really well equipped to take on this role. It's a global entity that has operates in over 40 countries across the world. It's an organization that has launched in the global north, but has really come from the roots of the global south. And what has positioned it to be able to serve refugees, displaced individuals, but also people who have been suffering from conflict and climate change and so many different disasters that you see across the world today, is that they are rooted that they come from those people. They are part of those communities and so forth. So obviously that was a really amazing call. He introduced me to Nazanin here, and we were actually already part of Welcome US and the Council of CEOs. and she facilitated a partnership with Church World Service that was one of the first of its kind as an institutional partnership to help with settling Afghan refugees into this country. So there's many other stories in between, but this latest experience has showed me that Islamic Relief as an institution and myself as an individual, we have a really critical role to play to ensure that the voices of those in the Global South are heard and amplified, so that they could play a role in ensuring the power dynamics of migration are changed as they need to be.
Great.
And, yeah, so the law part, I think, it was a great asset, but it was something that it didn't line up with my trajectory of where I wanted to be.
It's all right. I like that justice angle anyway.
Yeah.
Now, Nazanin, over to you.
I think some of the very best lawyers, for the record, are not practicing law. they're making impact in other ways. Thanks, and thanks so much, everyone. I'm so excited to be on this panel with my great colleagues and friends, and I think it's such an important topic. I'm Nazanin. I'm privileged to lead an organization called Welcome.US. We mobilize and empower American communities and a broader range of American institutions to help welcome and resettle refugees and other populations in need of safety. And we do this work because we believe that if we're tapping into the much broader capacity and expertise and willingness of our American communities, including our diaspora communities, including our private sector, including a wide range of community-based organizations who are often doing this welcoming work but haven't really been seen or recognized in doing that welcoming work, certainly aren't the recipients of large amounts of federal funding. We believe that if we're tapping into their capacity, the private sector's ingenuity, bringing the best of what they bring to their consumer engagement to the work of welcoming and resettling refugees, we can welcome many more and ensure that those newcomers thrive. And that gets to why I do this work, which is both personal and professional. I'm very much a product of the accidents of timing and geography that made it possible for me to achieve my human potential. My parents came to the United States from Iran as exchange students intending to go back. The Iranian Revolution happened in the last year of my dad's PhD program, and out of great concern for me and the future I would live in Iran, and we only have to look at what women are experiencing today to know how deep and true their fears were and are, they made the decision to stay and rend themselves from family and community and culture and language and everything they knew and everything they had dreamed and everything they had anticipated in order to create opportunities for me. And that has really motivated a series of professional choices where I'm doing my best to help remove those barriers for others in achieving their human potential, whether it's defined by race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or so often, as we're talking about with displacement crises, geography, circumstances entirely beyond people's control. So that's a big piece of what's motivated me in the work, and it's why we have taken this orientation to Welcome.US. We have to have a capacity to welcome many more. It's beyond the reach of our government systems and institutions alone, as you've already heard my colleagues talk about. The global displacement trends have more than tripled over the last decade, but the average number of refugees admitted by the US government has remained a paltry 70,000 per year over the last 3 decades, even as the displacement crisis has grown to the scale that we know it to be today, and even because of the reasons Sharif has already identified, we only anticipate it growing further. We need a capacity to welcome many more. It's gonna require all of us, and there are so many important contributions that our diaspora, our refugee and immigrant-led community organizations, our faith and veteran groups, and our private sector can make, and we need to create the pathways for their participation.
Thank you so much. I would like to go and back to you and to talk to you about your background and your thoughts after working with all those development donors in Afghanistan, from individuals to the World Bank. And when we think about power shift, I think your app that you created comes from a vision of being on the ground and what is needed. what recommendations would you make for all of us so that we can really change this up and be able to really, get the best of everyone who goes to whatever country, whether they're forcibly displaced or are a migrant?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So I think, to me, when I think about power shift, it's the ability to change gears without stopping the acceleration. As in a car, we would think about it. You stop a little bit, then you move forward. But a real sort of power shift is when you keep going and you accelerate even more. So that might be different in Catherine's perspective, but yeah, that's what I think about, and obviously, again, I would go and maybe clap for SID-US for actually bringing that discussion in. So if I think of myself, say when I was a refugee, and I think of today, and we do sort of a comparison between what has changed, and is it acceptable, how much has changed? I would say no. Absolutely not, right? 15 years ago, or actually 30 years ago, we didn't have identification systems for refugees. We still don't have it in most parts of the world. Now, we have institutions in the US and maybe some to half of that capacity in Europe than what we have here. There's amazing people doing amazing work for refugees and migrants here in the US, but that's not the case in many countries, right? So maybe starting with that identification part, which is very fundamental when you talk about refugees, that doesn't exist. And then from there on, there is a ripple effect, right? You don't have an identification system, so you basically don't have access to anything. And that includes access to finance, access to education, access to starting a business, you name it, right? Obviously, you don't have identification, that leads to access to nothing, and that leads to the cycle of refugees going through crisis and never really getting out of that. So that's something that absolutely needs a power shift right now, and those working in the space and beyond that should, and especially in the international development space where we all are somehow associated, I look at it as more than a job, right? Mm-hmm. You take a responsibility to say, hey, I will improve the water systems, I will improve the refugee crisis, and so it's not a job at that point. You have to wake up every day and really understand who your beneficiaries are and what you're doing for that. It gives you more responsibility than, say, a guy who works in finance, right? And so, yeah, that's, so lack of identification leads to lack of access, but most importantly, it's how a person changes by being a refugee. There is, I'm a through and through optimist. I think annoyingly optimist sometimes. But to start with, maybe I'll look at the aspect of how negative it is to be a refugee, right? You're probably one of the most vulnerable group of people to abuse in a country. Okay, in my example, I look at Pakistan, I look at countries that are not as developed. Now, obviously there is climate, there is a lot of issues that those countries face themselves, and so when you bring in an additional stress of people that are not supposed to be there, they get the most abused. And what has transpired to be very negative more recently, even really developed countries such as the UK, sort of going out there and raising the flag and very proudly from a policy perspective saying, hey, refugees are not welcomed and mocking them, it gives the everyday people an excuse to abuse people even more. So how does that affect a person negatively? I think, I don't have the statistics, but mental health becomes really bad, economic progress becomes really bad, and so from the other side though, a lot of people ask me, well, how did you go on to work with the World Bank, do all these big projects, and now you're sort of leading, trying to lead different solutions for these things? I think part of that also goes back to being in a place that I was naturally not supposed to be. You start learning new things. You start thinking of how, you're not allowed to go and study in a university. So I think a lot of credit for me being a technology person goes to being a refugee. We'd sit there and we would start learning things ourselves. Right. And so it gives you a different perspective. And you start looking at things a lot more differently than, say, another person would look at it. You have a certain drive that a lot of people might not have, and you have an appreciation for opportunity a lot more than, say, a person who's privileged with a lot more than that. So both, I think on the negative side, there is a lot of natural sort of negative points, but what that leads to can also be, sort of change makers and champions within our society. And maybe Naz would really know that, but the people who are migrants and they come into the US, they tend to do very well in specific fields because of that displacement.
Any field.
Any field. Well, and I'm just going to say, when I was in Jordan and I was looking at the Syrian camps and they didn't have enough medical care, I was talking to the Minister of Economy in this meeting, and I'm like, well, why don't you use the Jordanian doctors to provide medical services in the camps? Is that not like the easiest question? And they're like, oh no, because that would infringe upon our doctors here. The sector would be worried. So when we talk about those power shifts, we really have to ask those questions a different way, because there's usually not enough medical care in a country, and to see how we provide livelihoods to very capable people who have arrived on your shore. Sharat, I would like to ask you a little bit about the Islamic Relief USA and how you've engaged more in the refugee resettlement space, and what barriers do you see that impact the ability for new voices like yours to be involved in the sector more proactively?
Thank you so much, Anne. And I think when I think of barriers, I'm like Yunus, I'm optimistic by nature, but sometimes when I think about the barriers, I'm not so optimistic. But I think with us talking about them and hopefully signaling where we want to be and addressing them proactively, we can overcome them. There's four that I think of distinctly. First is political, second is financial, and third is related to disinformation and reputation management, and the fourth one is about actual capacity of institutions. And when I talk about political, I will give you an example. I was in Turkey after the earthquakes that took place. I was there in Hatay, Gaziantep, and Kahramanmaraş, the three provinces that were most impacted by the earthquakes that were so devastating. Over 50,000 people died, 2.5 million people were displaced. People's lives were upended significantly, and Turkey is a country that hosts over 4 million refugees currently, and many of those people that were impacted, of course, were refugees as well, and particularly Syrian refugees. And we met with refugees and sat with them and asked them some of the challenges they're facing. One of the challenges that came up was being able to register for school and to get medical care. And we asked them, is there not a will for them to get it? No, they could get it, they're able to get it, but they said the officials there and authorities, keep in mind this is a country that actually has already welcomed 4 million people, they still tell them, hey, let's wait until the elections are done and then we'll consider your application for registration. So that's what I mean about political will to help. If you look at the campaign that has been ongoing, the incumbent is supportive of refugees, and the challenger is actively campaigning against refugees coming into the country. And the country is split in this polarized way. So when I talk about politics, this is a area in the US that traditionally has been a bipartisan space. It's been an area where refugees coming into this country have been welcomed, whether you're on the right or on the left. However, obviously we're seeing that has changed. I will also share, when I talk about financial, that's more related to what I see here today in the United States. We, as Islamic Relief, we've been thankful to partners like Welcome US, like Church World Service and IRC, that have helped position us to be able to engage and to access more funding. However, when you work on the ground, and especially as we are beginning to open up affiliate sites across the country, we do notice challenges where some partners on the ground are concerned about adding another affiliate site there. And what does that mean to their own financial access to services that they were getting? So people are worried about the pie. Instead of looking at the big picture and saying, you know what, the need is so much greater, the capacity is not sufficient with our current institutions, let's add more institutions and grow that pie together. It's actually really a scarcity mindset in the sector that is really limiting the ability for us to serve the most vulnerable. And when we are making decisions as humanitarians based on budgets alone, without having that moral imperative that we have to serve these folks, then there's something wrong here. This is not why we got into this role to serve. So I really think financial, and it's, of course, that's impacted by politics, but it's such a big barrier for entry for many new and upcoming institutions to engage. The third is reputational and disinformation, and something that, unfortunately, when I was hired, and coming back to my legal background, part of the reason I was hired to join Islamic Relief almost a decade ago was to combat the negative PR and media that the organization constantly was dealing with. And these reputational concerns lead to a lack of even engagement with potential partnerships that could help facilitate work that can help serve so many folks. So when you look at a world today, a global world today, where technology plays a significant role, where one story, article comes out, it can really completely discourage people from working with one organization or another, or an institution that could actually facilitate a lot of good. So this, whether it's true or not, and that's one of the challenges I think that is being faced in the humanitarian sector as a whole. How are we able to, what's the truth that's out there, and who's credible to share that truth? And finally, I think the one area that I've seen as a big barrier for us now as we're embarking upon becoming, especially in our 3-year partnership agreement with International Rescue Committee, to eventually hopefully become a refugee resettlement agency, is capacity. And what I mean by that is you have institutions that have been around for decades, and some over a century, that have had a lot of time to build up the capacity that they have today. And in a short period of time, you're expected to scale up your organization to be able to act as effectively as these 9 or 10 other refugee resettlement agencies. And that is a big pull, and it's not easily done, and you do need support of agencies like IRC and SID-US who have done it in a very effective way to help support us. But it's a long road ahead, and we need a little bit of patience to build up the capacity we need to be able to serve effectively.
But I want to come in on this last point. I want to come in on all these really excellent points that you've made. Sharif, I feel like this is just a perfect demonstration of how much more capacity we tap into and how much more sensitivity we tap into when we broaden the playing field. But I want to come in starting with your last point on capacity. The capacity we're talking about is the capacity to be responsive to a set of government rules and regulations that have built up over 4 decades of a highly professionalized refugee resettlement program, right? And the question we should be asking is, like, how necessary are all of these factors? What do those factors themselves do to limit participation in welcoming and resettling many more? You know, to Sharif's financial point, we cannot expect that government appropriators our U.S. congressional appropriators are going to double or triple or quadruple the amount of money that they dedicate to the refugee resettlement portfolio in the midst of all the other crises that they face and the political challenges, that our nation and balances. So we have to be willing to tap into our American communities and what they have to give. But often this barrier around sort of the rules and regulations are another constraint. I would posit, Sharif, that nobody knows better than Islamic Relief how to serve the refugee populations that are arriving. 50% of the refugees that have been arriving since 2000 come from Muslim-majority countries. Why would I say? Come from Muslim-majority countries. Yet, there has not been a Muslim-led resettlement institution represented among the 10 resettlement agencies in the entire last, 2 decades. Every other faith is represented, but we haven't had an Islamic, led organization, even though that was the profile of over 50% of the refugees that were arriving. So I would say that Islamic Relief has incredible expertise to offer to this. It's just not the expertise that our government values, right? It's like risk assessment, it's meeting government rules and regs. But what we know is that, and it's the history of many of us in this room, the history of one of the histories of the United States is, hundreds and thousands and millions of people arriving with the proverbial $100 or $10 or no dollars in their pockets and making it. So how protectionist do we need to be? And how much is that actually just limiting how much we can do? And I want to share a couple numbers that really make the point of how much capacity is untapped. Welcome.US is an organization that is 20 months old. In that time, we have built a coalition of over 800 partners from every sector, community-based organizations, the private sector, leaders from, every part of our American tapestry. Through our Welcome Fund, we funded over 200 organizations, nearly 70% of which are refugee, diaspora, faith, and by faith, I'm really indexing on Muslim-led because we were trying to fill that gap, or veteran-led. And those organizations have mobilized over 22,000 volunteers to serve over 75,000 refugees, often providing the services that follow the initial 90 days that the traditional government partners, refugee resettlement agencies provide. Often the work that provides that ultimate sense of stability, belonging, inclusion, and the steps to self-reliance. It just gives you a sense of how much is untapped. And then I'm going to share one more that I think an innovation that has emerged out of these challenges. Right, the U.S. had to resettle 80,000 Afghan evacuees on a refugee resettlement system that in the previous year had welcomed just over 11,000 refugees. It forced these innovations in allowing greater participation from a wider range of Americans and American institutions. We piloted with the U.S. government and other partners a sponsorship program for Afghan evacuees, which is where Islamic Relief first got involved. And then when Russia invaded Ukraine and we had to break it open even more because the traditional resettlement infrastructure was already overwhelmed, we worked with the U.S. government to design an entirely private sponsorship model for Ukrainian refugees. And in a matter of weeks, thousands of Americans applied to sponsor. 130,000 Ukrainians have arrived through the sponsorship program over the course of the last year. And put that against the numbers I've shared about what the U.S. average refugee admissions have been for the last 3 decades. The program for Ukrainians was then expanded to 4 additional populations. And I don't know if any of you saw the CBS News reporting from the other night, but 1.5 million Americans have applied to sponsor people in need of safety from Ukraine, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. We're privileged to be a founding partner of the Welcome Corps, which is now the State Department's private sponsorship program that allows everyday Americans to help sponsor refugees from crises all over the world. That program was launched in January. We already have 41,000 Americans who have expressed interest in the program. That belies our national politics. Would any of you have thought that Americans were so eager to participate, can you imagine what it will do both for our capacity as a nation, but for our politics around welcoming people in need of safety if we bring our communities into the work in this way? We haven't seen the limits yet. We often describe Welcome's work as sitting at the intersection of global refugee crises and what Americans wish they could do about it. And it turns out there's a lot they wish they could do about it, including taking on the most in-depth responsibilities as a sponsor.
Well, thank you, Nazanin. So with these three examples, I realize we have the question and answer sign come up, and I really want to hear from you more. Let me just ask you, how would you, you've already shown change in 20 months, and a lot of it has to do with partnership and involving people, like people in this room who care about this every day. I'm going to ask each of you just to give me, if you could have one change that you could make happen, what would that be?
I'm going to start with expanding these sponsorship pathways. Every single time this opportunity for Americans to participate has been expanded, Americans have rushed through that door. So we should be doing as much of that as possible. We should be making it as easy as possible for Americans to participate.
And how would you do that? Is that more money? Is it more outreach?
What's so fascinating is it's not more money, right? Americans have put up over $500 million of their own resources to do this sponsorship work. It is policy permissions, right? Making it like what we need the U.S. government to do is issue the permissions for people to be able to come to the United States on the basis of their need for safety and to be able to be connected to sponsors. And we need to design programs that balance protection of newcomers, which is so necessary, right? People are arriving with tremendous vulnerabilities. It's why we've gotten engaged in the way we have. We want to make sure that that sponsors are vetted, that people are trained, that they know how to provide the services that need to be provided, that they're equipped to facilitate, the resettlement that needs to happen, and to ensure that that's successful for both sponsors and, most importantly, the people that they're welcoming. But that's work we can do together. Those are easy problems to solve.
It's those bridges and removing the barriers. Sharat, what would you add to this discussion?
Yeah, I think to build really on what Nazanin had mentioned, I think the challenge that I think that would really help with transforming and providing a new dynamic institutions to be involved in this space is to deregulate or to reduce the red tape that causes a lot of them not to be able to engage at all. And the second area is transparency. There are so many opportunities if you're in a certain circle that you could access, but if you're not in that circle, you don't even know they exist. So that lack of transparency really makes it difficult for new entities to engage, to learn, to build up their own capacity so that they can be participants and actively engaged. I think there's also really and with transparency comes poor communication in general. There is no communication at times to foster with the idea of growing further partnerships so that there can be more people involved and more institutions involved. And it's really, some of it is about all of the barriers that I mentioned before, but if there's ways to tackle the red tape, the ways to tackle the lack of transparency and access to resources, and then of course opening up lines of communication that could help foster better partnership that will allow more people to serve and more people to engage.
And Nasrat, one thing I would like to maybe have you touch on a little bit for your closing is the digital technology piece. And I think I had looked at like digital IDs when I was with the university, how to get certificates and education. It didn't seem that hard to me. I'm not a digital person, so I'm going to throw that back to you then.
Yeah, so I was going to respond with the same thing, actually. So there needs to be the problem, and more so internationally, but also locally here in the US, the lens at which we look at our solutions are pretty old-fashioned. and they are specific to the countries where the migrants and the refugees are. I propose, and a really good example of this was when Afghanistan collapsed in August 2021, and we were looking at the United Nations and all these major institutions leaving Afghanistan. At that time, it's just me and 20 team members that work with me. We were an software infrastructure provider for handmade sellers. Right. So basically enabling you to buy a scarf from somebody in Afghanistan, and given that the
like the Etsy.
Yeah, the Etsy of Afghanistan is the NPR article on that, very nice one. So just changing that infrastructure where we were able to pay vendors and get the vendors to ship their products to the US, just changing that to saying, and coming to Naz's point, I was shocked that we did one announcement and we got thousands of Americans on our platform buying these items for people who are internally displaced. And so building that infrastructure, a very small infrastructure, we're not Google, we're not Uber, we're a very small company. And adding on to that, the idea of IDs, right? Initially was, hey, how do we do these distributions? Some of these people don't have IDs. How do we go on about making sure that they are compliant, the KYC, the OFAC sanctions, this and that? Eventually, it came down to a very simple idea of doing people's household surveys, giving them an ID card, which we call OMAID, Hope IDs. And so the Hope ID is, after we do an assessment of a household, we understand that they live under $4 a day. We give them a simple ID that is generated by our own system. It has a QR code. So all of a sudden, a family that is in Afghanistan in a very rural place has a QR code that they can send to anyone anywhere in the world and start getting aid from them. If I think about it, it was a very simple process, but it just required a simple, shift in mindset.
And so they can get funding from friends and families elsewhere.
Yeah, and then adding further on to that, we have, the IOM, the WFP, the Save the Children, and so on. None of these institutions talk to each other in Afghanistan. Same as the case, I was in Turkey last week, and I was talking to refugees there. None of these institutions talk to each other. There is no, this is simple technology that we're talking about. So I think one of the biggest shift we can do is start relying on technology and maybe enforcing, or maybe not enforcing, but encouraging. Some of the best engineering minds in the world are focused on creating Snapchat face filters to the next TikTok and all of that, where you have some of the world's most pressing issues left behind. Now we look at the internet, or sort of 1990s, 95 to 2010, there was a huge sort of one wave of getting everybody connected. Then the second wave was payments. We started limiting from getting the internet to everyone. Now all of a sudden payments with PayPal was in like the 4 more developed countries. Then the Etsy is in the most 16 countries, right? The world's most handmade production happens in underdeveloped countries, but you have Etsy in the top 16. You have GoFundMe in the top 11 countries in the world's most. So that shift of using technology in the most urgent places needs to happen, and organizations that work in that place, they need to be worked at and seen as the next sort of, the Uber of humanitarian system is what we are pushing for. And it's a good cause for the engineers and for us, and hopefully for the whole world at a bigger scale, if we can replicate those models.
Yeah, well, it seems like we could solve a lot of problems here if we could just get people to help us do this. And I would say USAID, with their innovation challenge, should take that on and to really get engineers to work on that with you. I'm going to take the prerogative, we only have 5 minutes, so I don't know really how many questions we could do, and ask a visitor who's in our audience, Irina Pizlazvatra, to just come up for a second. She has a slightly different angle. She is forcibly displaced from Ukraine. She's currently in UK. And what she's looking at, as a question to you all, is how do you make it safe for refugees to go home? So a little bit not settling elsewhere. So Irina, if you want to come up.
My experience is a little bit different to you, because I'm currently a forcibly displaced person, and I spent 9 months in Germany, and now we are in UK, and I have faced no institutional barriers. Like within 2 months we got all the documents, healthcare, access to education for my 3 kids in Germany. In the UK, it happened even within 30 days. Everything was digitalized and smooth. The problem is with culture, because majority, in some countries, culture is not ready to treat you as equal. And this feeling of superiority of some communities make you move further. For instance, for us, UK is more inclusive than Germany. And our wave of displacement is called by experts as privileged marginalization. Why it's privileged? Because houses were more open for Ukrainians in Europe, because we look like European, and so we were welcomed everywhere. But this welcoming approach stopped at this basic safety stage, because if you want to really integrate or work somewhere, it's not that easy, because they they have this bias about refugees and their place in the community, and if you are a super highly educated person, they are not welcoming you in these executive positions or even in managerial positions. But what unites majority of us, that like 90% of Ukrainian forcibly displaced people are highly educated females with children, and 70% of us want to come back home, dreaming of it. We are not interested in settlement, and we are not interested even in full scale, like in integration into the community, because we want to help our motherland. So my NGO works to help Ukrainian women outside and inside Ukraine, and I'm not really interested in finding a job. I want to do everything to help my country to win, and this is what unites us. So we are very grateful to all countries which are supporting us, but I always remind some communities who work too much to integrate us that there is basic rule of inclusion: don't assume, ask, and ask us what we really want. Our population is not so much interested in the integration. We want to have the safety for our kids, and we want to work as hard as possible where we are to bring victory to Ukraine. So that's my contribution.
Thank you very much, Irina. So I'm a very bad moderator. We are out of time. It's 2:50. Chelsea's giving me the sign in the back. And I would like to really just thank you all for taking the time to be here. I would urge all of you to go to the websites and look at the organizations and help the organizations move forward. And I really thank you for putting in the room different ways of doing things. And the fact that in 20 months, Welcome US, and of course Nazanin is there, so I'm not so surprised it went so fast. But
it's really a credit to all the partners, and as you said, it's a credit to the partners in the American communities participating.
And that's why I was going to say it's the partnership and Islamic Relief, as part of that and sharing that together. And then, of course, my friend here, our Rice Award winner, who I'm so honored of all the things you've done. I'm very grateful. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.